For nearly 38 years, she had no voice. Her killer vanished without a trace. Detectives collected fingerprints. They preserved biological evidence. They interviewed witnesses and followed every lead they could find. Yet despite their efforts, one question remained unanswered for almost 4 decades. Who murdered Diane Matthews? Years turned into decades. Technology changed. Investigators retired. Cases came and went. Somewhere, the person responsible continued living his life, believing that September of 1988 had been left behind forever. But evidence doesn't grow old. Sometimes it waits. And in this case, it waited 38 years before revealing a truth investigators could never have imagined in 1988. The answer would eventually lead detectives hundreds of miles away from downtown Orlando to North Carolina. But before investigators could make an arrest, they would have to preserve a mystery that refused to die. This is the murder of Diane Matthews. September 8, 1988, began like any other day in downtown Orlando, Florida. Long before smartphones and social media existed, businesses still depended on answering services to stay connected with their customers. Companies relied on operators to receive calls and relay important messages around the clock. Inside one such answering service located at 227 North Magnolia Avenue, Diane Matthews was working quietly. What nobody around her knew was that she wasn't even supposed to be there that night. Years later, retired coworker Irene Simon would reveal that Diane had simply been filling in for another employee. Had circumstances been slightly different, she might never have been there at all. Life has a way of changing because of seemingly ordinary decisions. For Diane Matthews, accepting that shift would become the last decision she ever made. At the time, nobody could have imagined that investigators would still be trying to solve her murder nearly 4 decades later. And what happened next would leave even seasoned detectives horrified. The answering service occupied the 2nd floor of the building where Diane was working alone. At some point that evening, someone made his way upstairs and approached the office. Diane immediately realized something wasn't right. Who was this person? Why was he there? And perhaps most importantly, how had he gotten inside? Those questions would haunt investigators for decades. What happened next suggests Diane understood she was in danger. According to Irene Simon, Diane attempted to shut the office door to prevent the individual from entering. But he kept pushing, and he didn't stop. Simon recalled that Diane was forced backward with such force that her body's impression was reportedly left embedded in the wall. Imagine those final moments. A woman who wasn't even supposed to be working that evening suddenly finds herself fighting to prevent an intruder from entering her workplace. She pushes back. He pushes harder. Then, silence. No one knew that a brutal attack was unfolding behind that office door. And when it was over, Diane Matthews was gone. The crime scene investigators encountered would remain unforgettable. Diane's injuries were so severe that authorities were unable to immediately identify her by her facial appearance. A coworker later identified her because of her hair. Even now, nearly 4 decades later, retired colleagues continue describing her death as unimaginably brutal. For the people who knew Diane, time never completely erased the memory of what happened that day. But while investigators had discovered the victim, they still knew almost nothing about her killer. Was this someone Diane knew? Had she been specifically targeted? Was this a crime of opportunity? Or had her killer simply chosen the wrong victim at the wrong time? Detectives immediately began asking those same questions. And unlike many cold cases from the 1980s, investigators did something that would eventually make all the difference. They preserved the evidence. At the crime scene, detectives collected fingerprints and biological evidence. They conducted numerous witness interviews and began pursuing every lead available to them. There was just one problem. It was 1988. Today, DNA has become one of the most powerful tools available to investigators. Cold cases are routinely reopened decades later because forensic science continues evolving in ways previous generations could never have imagined. But in 1988, things were very different. DNA technology was not routinely used in criminal investigations the way it is today. Detectives could preserve evidence, but they could not yet unlock all of the answers hidden within it. In other words, investigators may have been holding the truth in their hands without realizing they would need to wait decades to uncover it. And that is exactly what happened in Diane's case. They collected the evidence. They protected it. And then they waited. Days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. Eventually, despite investigators' efforts, no suspect could be identified. The case that once shocked downtown Orlando slowly became something every detective fears. A cold case. For Diane Matthews' loved ones, justice appeared farther away than ever. But what nobody knew was that this story wasn't over. Somewhere, there was still a person responsible for Diane Matthews' death. And somewhere inside an evidence locker, preserved since September of 1988, was something that had survived the passing of time. For more than 2 decades, it waited patiently for science to catch up. When investigators finally received their first major breakthrough, it wouldn't come from Florida. It would come from another state. And it would begin with an entirely unrelated development. That breakthrough would eventually expose a connection nobody saw coming. For more than 20 years, investigators had nothing but questions. Then one day, a DNA profile entered into a national database would breathe new life into a case many believed would never be solved. The mystery of Diane Matthews was about to begin again. Cold cases have a way of testing the patience of everyone involved. For detectives, they become unfinished chapters. For families and friends, they become lifelong questions. And for victims, they become stories waiting to be heard again. By the early 1990s, Diane Matthews' murder had become exactly that, a case waiting for answers. Investigators had preserved the evidence. They had followed the leads available to them. But there was only so much they could do with the technology of the time. And so, they waited. Years passed. Then 10 years. Then 20. Downtown Orlando continued changing around the place where Diane had spent her final moments. New cases arrived. New detectives joined the force. Others retired. Yet somewhere inside an evidence room, investigators were still preserving pieces of a mystery from September of 1988. They had no way of knowing that the evidence collected that day would prove far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Sometimes, solving a cold case isn't about finding new evidence. It's about allowing old evidence to speak again. And that's exactly what was about to happen. One of the greatest advancements in modern criminal investigations has been the development of DNA technology and national databases capable of comparing genetic profiles from across the United States. Cases that once seemed impossible to solve have been reopened decades later because evidence preserved years earlier can now reveal what investigators couldn't see before. For victims of violent crimes, time is no longer always the enemy. Sometimes it becomes an ally. At some point during the investigation into Diane Matthews' murder, detectives developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at the crime scene and entered it into the national database used by law enforcement. Then they waited once again, and for years, nothing happened. No calls, no new suspects, no answers, until one day, the silence was finally broken. In 2013, 25 years after Diane Matthews was murdered, investigators received the first major breakthrough in the case. The DNA profile connected investigators to a man living in North Carolina. His name was Willie Eugene Carpenter. Suddenly, detectives had something they had spent decades searching for, a name. But a name and an arrest are not the same thing. Investigators still had an enormous amount of work ahead of them. Who was Willie Carpenter? Had he ever lived in Florida? Did he know Diane Matthews? Had he ever been considered a suspect before? Or was this the first time his name had ever entered the investigation? Those questions would now become detectives' newest challenge. And while viewers watching this story today know where it eventually leads, investigators in 2013 didn't have that luxury. For them, this wasn't the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of an entirely new one. After identifying Willie Carpenter, investigators traveled to North Carolina to interview him. Imagine that moment for a second. More than 25 years had passed since Diane Matthews was murdered. Detectives were now sitting across from a man whose DNA had placed him at the center of one of Orlando's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. For investigators, every word mattered. According to investigators, Carpenter denied knowing Diane Matthews. He denied ever meeting her. And he denied ever visiting the answering service where she was murdered. Those denials immediately created even more questions. If he had never met Diane Matthews, how could investigators explain the forensic evidence? If he had never been there, why had the investigation led detectives to his doorstep? And if he was innocent, was there another explanation investigators had failed to consider? At that point, detectives knew they needed more than suspicions. They needed stronger evidence. Much stronger. Because after 25 years, solving a murder isn't simply about identifying a suspect. It's about proving beyond reasonable doubt what happened decades earlier. And that's often one of the greatest challenges investigators face in cold case prosecutions. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. Physical locations change. Some evidence deteriorates over time. The passage of time creates obstacles that prosecutors must overcome long before a case ever reaches a courtroom. For many viewers watching this documentary, there is an important question that naturally comes to mind. If investigators identified Willie Carpenter in 2013, why wasn't he arrested immediately? The answer speaks to the extraordinary care required in cold case investigations. Identifying a possible suspect is only one piece of the puzzle. Investigators still have to establish probable cause sufficient to support an arrest. Every piece of evidence must withstand legal scrutiny because once an arrest is made, prosecutors must ultimately prove their case in court. After waiting 25 years for their first major breakthrough, investigators weren't interested in rushing. They were interested in getting it right. And sometimes, getting it right means waiting even longer. In Diane Matthews' case, that wait would continue for more than another decade. Imagine waiting once again for science and evidence to reveal the truth. By now, 35 years had passed since Diane Matthews was murdered. Nearly an entire generation had grown up without knowing who killed her. For many cold cases, this is where the story ends. There is a promising lead. There is renewed hope. And then, eventually, the trail goes cold once again. But not this time. Detectives had waited too long to stop now. The most important piece of the investigation had yet to come. More than a decade after speaking with Willie Carpenter for the first time, investigators would obtain something that would fundamentally change the direction of this case forever. And when they did, 38 years of silence would finally begin to come to an end. For 13 more years, detectives continued waiting patiently. Then, investigators would obtain a new DNA sample, one that would ultimately become another critical piece of the evidence supporting an arrest nearly 4 decades after Diane Matthews lost her life. The evidence had survived, and justice was finally moving closer than ever before. There is one part of this story that often gets overlooked. It's easy to focus on the arrest. It's easy to become fascinated by the DNA evidence and the remarkable fact that investigators never gave up after nearly 4 decades. But there is another question we haven't fully answered yet. If investigators identified Willie Carpenter in 2013, why did they wait until 2026 to make an arrest? 13 years is a very long time. And for many viewers, that timeline can feel confusing. After all, if detectives had a name in 2013, why wasn't this case immediately over? The answer reveals just how difficult cold case investigations really are. Television has created the impression that DNA evidence solves crimes overnight. Detectives collect a sample, a computer produces a match, and handcuffs appear moments later. Reality is usually much more complicated. DNA evidence can point investigators in a particular direction, but it doesn't automatically answer every question. Investigators still have to ask themselves, was this person ever legitimately present at the crime scene? Could there be another explanation for the evidence? Can we prove this case beyond reasonable doubt nearly 4 decades later? And perhaps most importantly, can we successfully present this evidence before a jury? Those questions become extraordinarily difficult to answer when 38 years have passed since a crime occurred. Think about everything that changes in 38 years. Businesses close. Buildings are renovated. Witnesses move across the country. Some witnesses pass away entirely. Memories become less reliable. And detectives are often forced to reconstruct events that occurred decades before some members of their investigative team were even born. Cold cases are unlike almost every other criminal investigation because investigators aren't simply fighting against a suspect. They're fighting against time itself. That is why patience matters so much. When investigators traveled to North Carolina in 2013, they weren't simply conducting another interview. They were reopening one of Orlando's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. Imagine sitting across from someone after spending 25 years trying to identify him. Imagine finally asking the questions investigators had been waiting decades to ask. Did he know Diane Matthews? Had he ever met her? Had he ever been inside the answering service where she was murdered? According to investigators, Willie Carpenter denied knowing Diane Matthews and denied ever visiting the location where she lost her life. He also declined to voluntarily provide a DNA sample during that interview. Suddenly, detectives found themselves facing yet another obstacle. The investigation wasn't over. In many ways, it was beginning all over again. Because investigators now faced a difficult decision. Do they move forward immediately with the evidence they have? Or do they continue waiting while they strengthen their case? Looking back today, we know which decision they made. They waited. And perhaps that decision explains why cold case investigations deserve so much respect. Investigators could have treated this case as a race. Instead, they treated it as a responsibility. After waiting 25 years for their first major breakthrough, they weren't interested in simply making an arrest. They were interested in making the right arrest. Those are not always the same thing. For the next 13 years, investigators continued building their case piece by piece. While much of that investigative work remains unknown to the public, one thing is abundantly clear. The detectives assigned to Diane Matthews' murder refused to allow time to dictate whether her case deserved their attention. They simply kept working. And perhaps that's one of the most remarkable things about this story. The public often sees the final chapter of an investigation, the press conference, the arrest warrant, and the handcuffs. What we don't always see are the thousands of hours that come before those moments. The files being reviewed late into the evening. The evidence being examined again and again. The difficult decisions investigators must make when deciding whether they have enough evidence to move forward. Cold case investigations are rarely solved by one extraordinary moment. They're usually solved by hundreds of ordinary moments spread across decades. Someone refusing to quit. Someone asking one more question. Someone deciding to review one more piece of evidence. Someone believing that a victim who lost her voice nearly 4 decades ago still deserves to be heard. And that is precisely what happened here. For 13 more years, investigators waited patiently. They preserved the evidence. They continued asking questions. And eventually, that patience would bring them closer to an arrest than they had ever been before. What they didn't know in 2013 was that their greatest breakthrough was still waiting for them. Because 13 years after their first interview with Willie Carpenter, investigators would finally obtain the piece of evidence they had spent decades waiting to secure. And when they did, this 38-year mystery would change forever. 38 years after Diane Matthews was murdered, investigators would finally obtain the evidence they needed to seek an arrest warrant. But before handcuffs could be placed on anyone, detectives had one final chapter of this mystery left to write. The evidence had survived. For 38 years, it waited patiently while science caught up with a mystery from another era. Detectives never stopped asking the same question they had been asking since September of 1988. Who killed Diane Matthews? By 2024, investigators were closer than they had ever been to answering that question. But they still had one final hurdle to overcome. They needed stronger evidence. Because in a courtroom, possibilities aren't enough. Investigators must be able to demonstrate that the evidence supports probable cause for an arrest. And after waiting nearly 4 decades, nobody wanted to make a mistake. The case had waited 38 years. Waiting a little longer to get it right was a price investigators were willing to pay. And then, in 2024, something changed. More than a decade had passed since detectives first interviewed Willie Carpenter in North Carolina. During their 2013 interview, investigators say Carpenter denied knowing Diane Matthews and declined to provide a DNA sample. The investigation remained active, but detectives still needed additional evidence before moving forward. Then came another opportunity. When investigators interviewed Carpenter again in 2024, he voluntarily provided a DNA sample. It was a decision that would ultimately change the course of this investigation forever. Imagine this moment from the perspective of the detectives working the case. Some of them weren't even members of the Orlando Police Department when Diane Matthews was murdered. Others inherited the investigation from detectives who had long since retired. Entire careers had come and gone while this case remained open. For 38 years, the evidence had been preserved with one hope, that someday it would speak clearly enough to reveal the truth. Now, investigators finally had what they needed to conduct additional forensic testing. The DNA sample was submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for further analysis. Then came another wait. Perhaps not 38 years this time, but waiting nonetheless. Cold case investigations teach detectives something few other investigations ever can: the importance of patience. Justice rarely operates on a convenient timeline. Sometimes it arrives immediately, and sometimes it takes almost 4 decades to find its way back home. When the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finalized its testing in 2025, investigators say the results further strengthened the evidentiary link between Carpenter and the biological evidence recovered from Diane Matthews' crime scene. Think about what that means for a moment. The evidence collected in 1988 had survived changing technologies, changing investigative techniques, and generations of detectives who refused to let this case be forgotten. Long after newspapers stopped printing headlines about Diane Matthews, the evidence continued waiting. It waited through the 1990s. It waited through the beginning of the internet age. It waited through the arrival of smartphones and social media. And finally, it helped investigators take another major step toward answering a question that had haunted this investigation for nearly 4 decades. Stories like this serve as powerful reminders that cold cases aren't necessarily forgotten cases. The passage of time can make investigations more difficult, but it doesn't automatically make them impossible. In Diane Matthews' case, time wasn't simply passing. It was quietly helping investigators build a stronger case. There was still work left to do. Detectives weren't interested in making an arrest simply because they could. After waiting nearly 38 years, investigators understood something better than anyone else. The strength of a cold case is measured not only by its evidence, but by its ability to withstand scrutiny inside a courtroom. Every piece of evidence would need to be carefully reviewed. Every investigative step would need to be documented. Every question would need an answer. Cold case investigations demand extraordinary patience because they are often built one careful decision at a time. No detective wants to jeopardize decades of work by rushing its final stages. So investigators continued doing what they had been doing for years. They kept working, slowly, methodically, carefully, and eventually, they reached the moment Diane Matthews' loved ones had been waiting almost 4 decades to see. In 2026, investigators sought an arrest warrant charging Willie J. Carpenter with first-degree murder. Then, on July 9, 2026, members of the United States Marshals Service North Carolina Regional Task Force arrested 68-year-old Willie J. Carpenter in North Carolina. Nearly 38 years had passed since Diane Matthews lost her life. 38 birthdays, 38 Christmases, 38 years of unanswered questions. And now, after all that time, someone was finally being held accountable through the criminal justice system in connection with her death. For retired coworker Irene Simon, the news brought tremendous relief. Reflecting on the arrest, she simply said, "It took so long." 3 simple words. Yet they perfectly capture what cold case investigations represent for so many families and loved ones. It took so long. Long enough for entire lives to change. Long enough for people to wonder whether justice would ever arrive. Long enough for many to fear it never would. And yet, here we are. After nearly 4 decades, investigators had made an arrest. But despite the significance of that moment, there are still questions the public doesn't yet have answers to. Did Diane Matthews know the person accused of her murder? Why was she targeted that evening? What exactly brought her alleged attacker to the answering service where she was working? Those answers may ultimately emerge as the judicial process continues. For now, what we know is this. The case is no longer a silent mystery from 1988. The evidence survived. The investigation endured. And 38 years later, investigators finally made an arrest. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't how long justice took to arrive. It's that investigators never stop pursuing it. The final chapter of this case has yet to be written, and its greatest lesson may be one we often overlook. Time may complicate justice, but it does not necessarily prevent it. For nearly 4 decades, one question haunted everyone connected to this case. Why keep fighting for justice when so much time has passed? The answer may be simpler than we think. Because time should never decide whether a victim matters. For many people, justice is something that happens immediately. A suspect is arrested. A trial follows. A sentence is handed down. But cold cases are different. They exist in the spaces between questions and answers. They remind us that justice doesn't always arrive according to our expectations or our timelines. Sometimes it arrives decades later. When Diane Matthews was murdered on September 8, 1988, nobody could have imagined that investigators would still be working her case in 2026. Entire generations have come and gone during that time. Children became parents. Technology transformed the world around us. Detectives retired while others took their places. And through it all, one thing remained unchanged. The pursuit of answers never stopped. There is something remarkable about that fact. In today's world, news stories often last only a few days before they're replaced by newer headlines. Public attention moves quickly from one tragedy to another. Yet inside evidence rooms throughout the United States, investigators continue working cases that many people stopped talking about decades ago. Because to the families, friends, and loved ones of victims, these cases never truly become old news. They simply become longer waits for answers. For nearly 38 years, Diane Matthews waited for investigators to identify the person they allege is responsible for taking her life. Nearly 38 years. It's difficult to fully appreciate what that means. It means wondering whether justice would ever come. It means wondering whether evidence collected in another era would still have a voice. And it means refusing to give up, even when every passing year makes the road ahead more difficult. Cases like this also teach us something extraordinary about modern forensic science. When investigators collected evidence in 1988, they could never have known how dramatically DNA technology would evolve in the decades to come. What they didn't know was something much simpler. Evidence matters, preservation matters, and patience matters. Had investigators failed to properly preserve the evidence collected in Diane Matthews' case, this story might have ended very differently. There may never have been another opportunity. There may never have been an arrest. And there may never have been answers. Instead, nearly 38 years later, investigators were finally able to return to that evidence and ask it questions that simply couldn't have been asked in 1988. And remarkably, after all those years, it answered. There is another lesson hidden inside this story that often goes unnoticed. Cold cases aren't simply solved by technology. They're solved by people who refuse to quit. Behind every forensic breakthrough are detectives reviewing old files. Behind every DNA analysis are investigators asking whether one more lead remains unexplored. Behind every arrest are countless hours spent preserving evidence, conducting interviews, and building cases strong enough to withstand legal scrutiny. Justice may sometimes be delayed, but it rarely arrives accidentally. It is usually the result of extraordinary persistence. And perhaps that's why this case resonates so deeply. Because at its heart, this isn't simply a story about DNA evidence or scientific advancement. It's a story about perseverance. It's a story about refusing to allow time to become an excuse for forgetting. And above all else, it's a story about Diane Matthews. Before we leave this case, there is one final detail worth remembering. When Diane Matthews went to work on September 8, 1988, she wasn't expecting to become part of one of Orlando's oldest unsolved murder investigations. To her, it was simply another day. She couldn't have known that detectives would spend nearly 4 decades fighting to uncover the truth. She couldn't have known that evidence collected that day would outlive decades of technological change. And she certainly couldn't have known that people she would never meet, investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and even viewers watching this documentary, would still be speaking her name almost 4 decades later. That may be one of the most remarkable things about cold case investigations. They remind us that victims are more than police reports and case numbers. Behind every investigation is a human life that mattered deeply to someone. It is easy to become fascinated by the forensic breakthroughs and investigative twists that eventually solve these mysteries. But we should never allow those details to overshadow the people at the center of these stories. This case began with a woman going to work. It became a nearly 38-year search for answers. And today, it stands as another reminder that while justice may sometimes move slowly, the pursuit of truth doesn't simply expire with time. Some evidence waits. Some questions survive, and some voices refuse to be forgotten. As this case continues through the judicial process, there are still questions that remain unanswered publicly. Future court proceedings may provide additional details surrounding the events of September 8, 1988, and investigators may yet reveal information that has remained undisclosed for decades. For now, what we do know is this. After nearly 38 years, investigators finally made an arrest in connection with Diane Matthews' murder. After nearly 38 years, this case is no longer waiting silently inside an evidence room. And after nearly 38 years, a victim whose voice was stolen has once again become the center of her own story. Time matters, but truth matters more. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this case leaves behind. If there is one thing cold case investigations continue teaching us, it is that those responsible for violent crimes are often counting on two things: time and silence. Cases like this remind us that neither is guaranteed to protect them forever, because evidence remembers. And sometimes, it waits patiently for decades before telling its story. Diane Matthews waited nearly 38 years for hers. Thank you for watching Crime Vault. If stories like this remind you why cold cases should never be forgotten, there's another investigation you need to see. In that case, DNA evidence exposed a truth investigators completely missed for decades and changed everything they thought they knew about a shocking murder. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching. Because somewhere tonight, another cold case is still waiting for its voice to be heard.